Jesuit Volunteer. JVP, or the Jesuit Volunteers Philippines, is a volunteer group that trains and sends volunteer to the country. And on next year, in June of 2025, it's going to be the 45th year of service of JVP to the church and country. And so we prepared year-long activities, and one of which is the webinar that we have it monthly. So this third webinar in September, we are honored to have Dr. Richard Chu, who's going to talk about the creation of a Chinese other in the Philippines through time and space. Dr. Chu belongs to the JVP Batch 17. I'm sorry, Batch 7. And he was assigned at Cebu, Ateneo de Cebu now, and that was Sacred Heart School for Boys during the time that he was missioned there as a teacher. Dr. Chu graduated from the Ateneo de Manila University for his undergraduate and then took his master's and PhD in California. His master's in Stanford University and University of Southern California for his PhD. He have written several books, and the first book was The Chinese and Chinese Mestizos of Manila, and the second book was Chinese Merchants of Binondo in the 19th century. So I would like to welcome Dr. Chu to start our webinar today.
Good morning sa inyong lahat. I'm very honored to have been invited to present during the commemoration of the founding of the JVP. And I would like to thank Blas and everyone in the JVP office, as well as everyone who's here to participate in this webinar. So as you can see, it's dark here because it's nighttime. It's only Friday night, but I'm happy to be spending the next hour and a half with all of you. Thank you again for waking up early. I know this is a Saturday for our kababayans, and so let's go on with the webinar. So I'd like to start with sharing my PowerPoint. I hope everybody can see it. Can people hear me, and can people see the PowerPoint?
Yes, Rich.
Okay.
Yes.
You. So as you can see, the title, there are actually two titles. The first is Sangley, Intsik, Tsinoy, TDK. So these are four terms, and I will explain to you the terms later on. And the main title of this webinar is Machinations, Myths, and Manipulations: the creation of a, quote, Chinese other in the Philippines through time and space. So you will, as we go along the webinar, you will understand why I use these words, machinations, myths, and manipulations, to refer to how the Chinese in the Philippines is a creation, by society. So first of all, you may have heard of the word Intsik, no? So this term is actually from Hokkien. Hokkien is the language that most of the Chinese in the Philippines, who have been there for centuries, speak. Hokkien is the language being spoken by the people who live in the southern part of Fujian province. where most of the Chinese in the Philippines come from. And the Hokkien word Intsik, no, is the origin of the word Intsik. Intsik in Hokkien means his uncle. And so how did his uncle or Intsik become Intsik? This has to do with the history of the Chinese migration to the Philippines. Oftentimes, someone from the village would first set foot on the Philippines, and then his relative, mostly male relatives like his brother, uncle, son, would come also to join him in the Philippines. And when he would be introduced, when the newcomer would be introduced to other people, that person is often introduced as, this person is Injak, his uncle. And so this is the theory of the origin of the word Inchik. In my research in the history of the Chinese in the Philippines, in a 19th century text, I already found the word Inchik being used. So even as far back as the 19th century, Inchik was already being used, and it may even be used earlier, but we have no documentary evidence yet. And this term is also so that's what the term means, no, or how it came to be. And it's also a term that's used not just in the Philippines, but also in Indonesia and Malaysia. They say Intsik, no? But it means differently. The word means differently in different places. And so in Malaysia or Indonesia, it actually means it refers to sir. So it is a term of respect, no? But in the Philippines, sorry, what's in the Philippines, it has do you see something on the screen that's a chat? Anyway, do you see some blast? There's something on the screen that I might have pressed. It's the chat. It's a group chat.
Wala, Rich. There's none.
Okay. Anyway, let me get out of this first because there's a chat screen on my screen. Okay, better now. So sa Philippines, the word inchik has become kind of a derogatory term because like sometimes when you hear people use the word inchik, it's connected to a kind of a sort of with a negative meaning. And when I was growing up in the Philippines, I would sometimes hear the word being used to criticize the Chinese. Like you would hear, oh, yung mga inchik na yan, ang kukuripot, o yung mga inchik na yan, mandaraya, o so on and so forth. So we will later on try to understand why this term, which originally was just a term for introduction to a relative, had become a negative term, at least to us, when I hear the word inchik. And then one must understand that there are also other terms, or that it's not just a one-way kind of we could say discrimination or antagonism or maybe even slight disrespect from the Filipinos part using the term Intsik, because the Chinese in the Philippines also has a term that they use for Filipinos, which is Wana. And Wana is again a Hokkien term, but it means foreigner or barbarian. So many Chinese in the Philippines use this word without really knowing the origins of this term, and that it is also derogatory. So we will also learn later on why Filipinos use the term Wana, and what it implies in terms of the way they look at the Filipinos. Now, this webinar will focus on two topics. One is looking at the history, the long history of the Chinese and the Filipinos. And the second part, or the other element of this lecture or webinar, is my analysis of the historical reasons why many Filipinos today have forgotten that many of them also have Chinese roots, that their ancestors were Chinese, and I'll try to explain the historical reasons for the forgetting or erasure of this long history between the Chinese and the Filipinos in present times. So I'll start by, as you can see here, the Chinese in the Philippines have been trading with the inhabitants or the natives of the different islands of the Philippines, even before Spanish colonization. This is proven by artifacts that have been excavated in different parts of the Philippines. And these are on the slide, are jars or ceramics that were made in China, but then were traded for other goods in the Philippines. And these jars or ceramics dated back to the 10th century, or from the 10th century to the 17th century. So it's been recorded in both Chinese and other records that the Chinese in China, especially those living in the southern part of China, had long been trading with the different natives of what we call today Southeast Asia, and with those who lived in the different islands of what we now call the Philippines. Come, it's not. I'm trying to move on to the next slide. Okay, so here you can see a map of the trade routes that these Chinese traders were engaged in long ago. Again, even before the Spaniards came to colonize the Philippines. You see that in the northern part here in Fujian, and also in the region of Guangdong, people would sail across the seas and then trade with the natives of the different islands of what we now call Southeast Asia. And it was in the coming of the Spaniards that more and more Chinese started to settle in the Philippines. So before Spanish colonization in 1565, there were very few Chinese, at least very few Chinese recorded who were living in the Philippines. Most of them just came as traders, and then they would return back to their home villages. But when the Spanish colonized the Philippines and created this Manila Acapulco galleon trade in 1565, where goods from China like silk, cotton, um, would be shipped from Manila to Acapulco, and then these items would be exchanged with silver that would then be brought back to Manila to be distributed to those who participated in the Manila Acapulco galleon trade. So it was the coming of the Spaniards that slowly the Chinese came to settle in the Philippines. And that's why they called Binondo the oldest Chinatown, because Binondo was established in 1594 when Bishop Dasmariñas donated the I mean, Governor Dasmariñas donated the island of Binondo to the Dominicans so that Binondo could be a missionary site for the Dominicans, where Chinese who converted to Catholicism would be allowed to live in Binondo with their families. So with the increasing with the expanding colonial economy in the Philippines, more and more goods from China were brought to the Philippines. And this is one evidence of the long history of the Chinese presence and influence in Philippine economy. And we can see that from certain products or goods that are now very common in the Philippines, and the names or that we use, such as toyo, siopaw, lumpia, hikaw, bimpo, bakya, and susi, are actually derived from Hokkien, no? From the Chinese language Hokkien. So this is again a demonstration of how the long history of Chinese, especially through trading, had shaped or influenced Philippine society. During the Spanish colonial era, many of them came to fill in some of the jobs that were needed to feed, to house, to dress the Spaniards as well as the locals. So some of them came as dyers, barbers, sawyers, and so on and so forth. So during the Spanish colonial era, many of the Chinese in the Philippines were laborers or were workers, unlike today where most of the Chinese that we know who live in the Philippines are in business. No? And again, there is a historical reason why today most of the Chinese in the Philippines are from the entrepreneurial class and not really in other occupations. So these are some photos of the Chinese taken back in the probably late 19th century or early 20th centuries. So you could see that during the time, the way that they dressed and the way that they shaved their hair, their head, easily gave away that they were from China. And this was the kind of dressing that they had until 1911, when the Qing dynasty was toppled. And so up until then, so these photos at least were around or before 1911. And on the right, you can see, these vendors on both pictures. You could see that these are Chinese vendors, but on the right, you could also see them on the streets, and behind them, I imagine was the Manila Cathedral. No? So one other evidence of the long history and impact of the Chinese in the Philippines could be seen in material culture. Aside from food, you can see that because many of the Chinese came as carpenters, and one of the famous carpenter was Atay, Eduardo Atay, who was from Pampanga, and he made such furniture that was uh, that were bought or prized by the Spanish or the elites. For example, living in Intramuros, and on the left side is the what they call the Atay bed, which is a very distinct design. One could easily say that this is an Atay furniture. The same thing with the drawer or the closet on the right side. And when one looks at architecture, you can also see the influence of the Chinese. You see here the Binondo Church, and the church tower is built like a pagoda, especially where the angles, the sides are with 8 sides, which is the what a pagoda has. So it's no surprise that in Binondo or in Manila that these churches or houses have Chinese influence, because many of the architects or the laborers were also Chinese. So here, for example, you can see many houses before in the rooftop, where you could see that the tip of the roof, have these pointed shapes, because this was again a design that was also taken from Chinese architecture. And also here, because many of the Chinese were the ones who sculpted the Catholic images. You see here the image of the Virgin Mary, where the face and the features of both the Virgin Mary and the child Jesus are actually similar to the Chinese goddesses, uh, especially the Chinese goddess Kuan Yin Ma. So you can see that the features of the Virgin Mary is Chinese-like. And another influence or contribution, you might say, that the Chinese had was not just in material culture, but also in the economy. They had set up, many of them, these what we might call the sari-sari store today. So on the right side, you could see that many of the Chinese also set up these sari-sari stores below their house. Oftentimes, they have their store at the ground level of their house, and then they would live on the second floor. And that's one way that they prospered, because it's like anyone can just come and knock on their door, or if they needed anything at night. So it's like your earlier version of 7-Eleven, because these Chinese tiendas were always open, because they were located just below the house of the family who owned it. And so today we see thousands of sari-sari stores also around the country. Um, Now, the influence or the close interaction between Chinese and Filipinos can also be seen in the familial terms that we use to address members of our family. Uh, I, you know, almost all of us know or use the term ate to refer to somebody, a female who's older than us. But ate is actually from achi, which is a Chinese or a Hokkien term to refer to the eldest sister. Ditse is also from diti, which is again a Hokkien term. And sanse, kuya, all of these terms that we use to address our siblings are actually Hokkien terms or Chinese terms. So how is this that within within Filipino families we use these Chinese terms, you know? Uh, and this could be explained by the fact that many Chinese, mostly men who came to the Philippines during the Spanish colonial period, intermarried with local women, no, with Filipinas, and so when they had children, they used these terms that they inherited from their father's side. And so this is a map of Binondo. And also you can see that there's Intramuros to the south, and then Parian. Parian is the place where non-baptized or Catholic Chinese mostly resided. So other evidence of the long interaction between the Chinese and Filipinos are found in the mestizo children, the Chinese mestizos. So San Lorenzo Ruiz, for example, is a Chinese was a Chinese mestizo, as well as Mother Ignacia del Espiritu Santo. And here is a portrait of a Chinese mestiza. From this portrait, which probably also was taken during the 19th century or done during the 19th century, it is from the 19th century, reflects a or demonstrates a Chinese mestiza from a wealthy family. You can see it from the kind of cloth that she's wearing, which is probably piña fiber, and also the jewelry that she has. So many of the mestizos, including Jose Rizal, um, were from the middle or upper class of the because their fathers were mostly traders or merchants, and therefore they were capitalists and they had wealth. So many Chinese mestizos were seen as the part of the elites in Philippine society during the Spanish colonial period, and they were seen as they were the ones who set the fashion or the fashion for the day. You know, sila yung trendsetters, so to speak, during that time where other Filipinos would look up to them, aspiring to follow their sense of fashion, you know, their tastes and the way of life. So many Filipinos, prominent ones, like Jose Rizal I mentioned, have Chinese ancestry. Jose Rizal's great-great-grandfather was a Chinese. And also Emilio Aguinaldo was actually half Chinese, as well as we know Corazon Aquino and Ferdinand Marcos also have Chinese ancestry. So many of prominent Filipinos today have Chinese ancestry, but many actually don't know that, or may have just heard that they might have a Chinese ancestor, but then have either forgotten or just lost any trace or knowledge about their Chinese ancestry. And this is more surprising because we see now how there is a tension between Chinese and Filipinos, as if that these two groups of people were always apart or separate. But that's not the case because, as I'm showing here, during the Spanish colonial period, they really had a lot of close interaction with one another, whether in terms of trading, in terms of intermarriage, and so on and so forth. Um, we see that there was more uh, cooperation, there was more intermingling between Chinese and Filipinos at the time. But then in the course of the 20th century, we see that more and more the Chinese was being seen as a separate other, as distinct from the Filipino. So you're either Chinese or you're either or Filipino. But back in the Spanish times, you could be a Chinese mestizo, so you could be both Chinese and Filipino. And there was a category for those of mixed heritage, the Chinese mestizo. And as you know, in Philippine history, during the Spanish colonial period, the Spanish subjects were categorized into three: the Sangley, or the Chinese. I will explain later on what Sangley means, and the Chinese mestizo, and the Indios. So um, my own research has focused on these questions, one of which was one of which is, why have many Filipinos forgotten or ignored their Chinese roots? Another one is, amongst the Chinese, how did it happen that purity of blood mattered so much that marrying a Filipino was and continues to be taboo? And another question is, how is it that over time, when the Chinese and the Filipinos had had such a long history of interaction, that as a racial divide persists between the two? So I'll try to explain in the next, hopefully, 10 minutes. I'm aware of the time. What were the reasons why, after a period of time, a period of long interaction between the Chinese and Filipinos, that the Filipinos and Chinese started to become separate? So we have to attribute this to colonialism, because under Spanish colonialism, the Spaniards created this classificatory system that separated the Sangley. As I mentioned earlier, Sangley was the term that was used to refer to the Chinese by the Spaniards. And it came from the word Xiong which is another Hokkien word. Xiong means somebody who comes often. So parang immigrante, no? You could say that somebody who's a sojourner, someone who came back and forth uh, during the Spanish colonial period, was a Sangley, because these Chinese who came to the Philippines, they would go back to China and then return to the Philippines. No, so that became a term to refer to the Chinese. And so aside from Sangley, there were Chinese mestizos, and then there were Indios, and they were taxed accordingly. So at that time, wala pang Filipino, no? I mean, Filipino was the term used for Spaniards who were born in the Philippines. But the rest of the Spanish subjects were either Sangley, Chinese mestizo, or Indio. So because of this, then you see already some segregation between who was Chinese and who was Filipino or Indio. But at least at this time, there was a recognition of a Chinese mestizo, of the intermarriages, or the mixing of the Filipinos and Chinese, as can be seen in the offspring. which they termed Chinese mestizo. However, during the American colonial period, the Americans did away with these classifications from the Spanish times and then created, through the Philippine Bill of 1902, citizenship laws, or it nationalized citizenship by creating the Filipino to refer to anyone who's a citizen of the Philippines. However, the Chinese were not considered Filipino citizens, and they were categorized instead as a foreigner or alien. No? So this already gave way to a binary, for a dichotomy, a division in terms of ethnic and you might call racial categorization of a Filipino and a Chinese. And the Chinese mestizo categorization was removed officially, as well as Indio. So starting with the American colonial period, you were either Chinese or Filipino. And because the Americans discriminated against the Chinese, made it also difficult for them to become Filipino citizens. And the Americans also had an anti-mestizaje ideology. In the United States at the time, the mixing of blood that produced a mixed blood child was seen as something negative. No, that there is a emphasis in the purity, in the maintaining of the purity of one's blood. So what happened then was that they discouraged the Chinese from intermarrying with Filipinos, and they also criminalized bigamy or polygamy, because many of the Chinese who came to the Philippines also had families back in China. So many of especially if you were wealthy, a Chinese man had a wife and children back in China and a wife and children in the Philippines, which under the Spanish times was also considered bigamy, but the Spaniards turned a blind eye towards bigamy. And instead, the Americans were the ones who really criminalized bigamy. And this led to less and less intermarriages between Chinese and Filipinos. And you can see here, for example, in a newspaper cartoon where the Chinese began to be seen as an enemy. Here on top, you see the Chinese sitting and other Chinese turning this screw to squeeze the Filipino. Here it says Industria Filipina. And with their continuing immigration, that the Chinese were actually destroying or harming Philippine industry by taking over the jobs or taking over the businesses in the local economy. So here's another cartoon that you could see from a newspaper, The Independent, from dating back to September 18, 1915, where it also again show negatively the image of the Chinese. On the left side, you see that the Chinese came or entered the Philippines, and they appeared very poor, sort of like uncouth. But after they leave, so los que salen, when they leave the Philippines, oftentimes they're already rich. No, they have become wealthy. So this was the image that became that was spread during the American colonial period. And it's not to say that during the Spanish times there was also there was no discrimination against the Chinese. There was, but in the American colonial period, the American colonial state brought to the Philippines its own very strong anti-Chinese ideology. In the United States in 1882, they excluded the Chinese laborers from coming to the United States because they were seen as competitors of American white labor. In the Philippines, the Americans also did the same thing. It applied the Chinese exclusion laws in the Philippines in 1903 that barred Chinese laborers from coming to the Philippines. And that's why only merchants could come in. They were exempted from that exclusion law. And that's why starting then, more and more Chinese had to enter business or become merchants in order to be able to enter and live in the Philippines. Now, another evidence of how American colonialism had increasingly separated the Chinese from the Filipinos is the statistics of intermarriages between Chinese men and local women. So here you can see that during the Spanish colonial period, there were double digits, the numbers of Chinese, of marriage applications between Chinese men and local women. But during the American colonial period, there were fewer and fewer applications for intermarriages between Chinese men and local women. So over time, there were other factors like modern Chinese nationalism in China itself. They were starting to try to reach out to the so-called overseas Chinese, including those who were living in the Philippines, and granting them Chinese citizenship. So if you were a Chinese who lived in the Philippines at that time, and you could not become a Filipino citizen, so you had no other recourse but to be a Chinese citizen, because then you would have the protection of China or the Chinese government. And the Chinese government also started to propagate or spread the notion of racial purity, stating that the Chinese race had to be preserved, that if you were a loyal and a filial Chinese, you have to remain Chinese. You cannot intermarry or marry a person of another race, because then you are diluting the purity of your Chineseness. In the same manner, in the Philippines at the time, there was a rising sense of nationalism, especially after World War II. When the Philippines became independent, and so as the Filipino leaders strove to create or unify the Philippine nation, they became more and more nationalistic and viewed the Chinese as, again, an alien, an other, and this increased again the separation between the Filipino and the Chinese. And just remember, China became communist in 1949. So the Chinese in the Philippines then, because the Philippines was an ally of the United States and was heavily anti-communist, the Chinese in the Philippines then were seen as possible sympathizers of communist China. So these were the contributing factors that led to more and more kind of xenophobia, as you may call it, in the Philippines, where the Chinese were seen as not just politically disloyal to the Philippines, but also possibly threats or enemies of the country. And this could be reflected in the different laws that the Philippine government had created to discriminate against the Chinese, such as the Corn and Rice Industry Nationalization Act of 1960, which removed and forbade the Chinese from engaging in the distribution of corn and rice. Now, under Ferdinand E. Marcos, the previous or the elder Marcos, things changed a bit when he, under letter of instruction 270, allowed the mass naturalization of the Chinese. So that was in 1975, and that allowed many of the Chinese who could not return to China because China was communist and they didn't want to go back to China anyway, and who were living in the Philippines and who had businesses there in the Philippines, who had families, who for decades, were Chinese citizens or didn't have any Filipino citizenship. This was the chance for them to become Filipino citizens. This is one reason why the elder generation of the Chinese in the Philippines supported Marcos, because they saw that he was the one who allowed them to become Filipino citizens, in 1975. So I'll hurry on because again I'm conscious of time. Here are again some of the cartoons that one sees in the newspapers. The left, on the right, on the left is a newspaper, Philippine Free Press from 1926. Where again the Chinese is depicted as milking the Philippine business, while the Americans and the Filipinos continue to fight, and the Chinese silently milks Philippine business for profits. And then there's also on the right side a cartoon depicting the Chinese as opium smokers. So they were depicted by media not just as economic pariahs, but also social pariahs because they were addicted to opium. And here you could see that although opium smoking was illegal, that these Chinese were bribing this person who was guarding the opium den, bribing him so that they could enter and smoke opium. So this is another cartoon back in 1919. I'll just talk quickly. So here on the left side, you have the Filipino store or Tienda Filipina, and then you have on the right the Chinese store, and that the store of the Chinese is the one being patronized by Filipinos, while the one of the Filipina or the Filipino is nilalangaw. There are these flies here. And then also below, you could see that in 1917, how they depicted the Chinese and the Filipino vendor, both of which started at the same time in 1907, vending on the streets. But as time went by, the Chinese became richer, and whereas the Filipino continues to be poor. Okay, so today we see that there's an increasing tension between the Chinese and the Filipinos, especially because politically there's this dispute over these islands in the South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea, as you know it, no? And ex-President Duterte also became more friendly to China, towards China. And so that resulted in more POGOs, Philippine offshore gaming operators coming into the country and more Chinese investments in the country. So that resulted in both good and bad, but basically a negative consequence in terms of how Filipinos perceive China and also its people. The unfortunate thing there is that many Filipinos do not distinguish between Chinese nationals or Chinese-owned businesses and Chinoys, no, or Chinese who have lived in the Philippines for generations, or who are already Filipinos in terms of citizenship and also in terms of ethnic identification. One example of how Filipinos oftentimes conflate the Chinese from China and the Chinese from the Philippines can be seen in this newspaper article from Rappler dating back to June 2018, when it listed the Philippine Chinese Chambers of Commerce and Industry, as well as the Leong Tech Go Family Association, both of which donated 7 million pesos to the Marawi rehabilitation, as Chinese organizations or associations, meaning that these were organizations from China. And later on, the editor of Rappler had to correct themselves and publish this correction, editor's note, stating that these two have been removed from their list of Chinese business people who had visited and talked with President Duterte. And that they indicated that these are Filipino Chinese organizations and not China-based organizations. So I'll also skip this. Another example of the continuing sort of ethnic antagonism or the othering of the Chinese in the Philippines can be seen here in the case of Tiffany Uy, who in 2015 graduated from UP with a degree in biology and with the highest recorded general weighted average since World War II. So, so this is a Chinese in the Philippines. She's a Chinese Filipino, but who went to the state university and garnered the highest grade and honors. But if one looks at the Facebook post of her back then and the comments that you see from this post, people were questioning her as a Filipino. Someone said, "Oh, another Chinese blood listed in the history of UP, a university supposed to be for Filipino and for poor." Okay, if you can read that on the screen, that's the first comment. And another one is, "Hope she has the heart of a Filipino, because obviously she's Chinese by family name." Okay, so and then you have somebody said the only way to get that kind of grade is strict Chinese parents. Yeah, so again, there's also that kind of racialization, a stereotyping of a Chinese, what kind of students they are, and so then there are these in the following comments, sort of like a debate. Someone said, Wilson Kua said, "Oh, she's Chinese." And then somebody said, "Half Chinese yata." And then somebody said, "Chinese." And then somebody said, "Chinese Filipino." Chinese, So again, the constant sort of separating Chinese Filipinos of Chinese blood from being Filipino, as you can see that. So what's the response or reaction of Chinese in the Philippines, to this constant continuing othering of the Chinese in the Philippines, constant sort of discrimination, against them and seeing them as separate or non-Filipino. One of the things they did was to create this term Tsinoy, which is a combination of Chino plus Pinoy. So Tsinoy, which makes it sound like the Chinese is biologically Pinoy as well, because it's again, as you can see, the term grafted the two terms as if they were inextricably or intertwined. That Chinoy is also a Pinoy. So you can see that in movies, for example, in Mano Po in 2002, where Lily Monteverde, who just died, the producer of Regal Films, but she's Chinese, came up with these movies, Mano Po, to try to emphasize to the Filipino audience that Chinese Filipinos or Chinoys are also Filipino by heart. So in this scene, this is I think Vera Lim or Vera Go, played by a Filipino actress, Maricel Soriano, but she's playing a Chinese Filipino character. And she had gone back to China to bury her father who died. And then on her way back to the Philippines, on the airplane, she was given the immigration card that she had to fill up in order to go return to the Philippines. And at that time, her father actually, and her family had witnessed or experienced a lot of struggles and hardships. Her sister was kidnapped, and then her boyfriend was killed, or somebody, a member of the family was killed because they were Chinese Filipinos, no? And so when she was returning to the Philippines, she was contemplating on whether to leave the country or not. So let's look at this scene where she received the immigration slip or form. Oops. Oops, sorry.
Umalis man ako sa Pilipinas, sa ayaw at sa gusto ko, dala ko pa rin ang Pilipinas. Kaya bakit ko pa aalisan ang hindi ko naman lubusang mapakasan?
So in that scene, you could see that she signed her nationality as Filipino. Again, this is to emphasize, that the Chinese in the Philippines do consider themselves as Filipinos, no? Despite all the struggles that they had been encountering. So I'll skip to the last slide. There have been efforts by the Chinese community in the Philippines to sort of reach out to the Filipino community and say, hey, we're also Filipinos. We know that China now has a bad rap, and that the two countries, China and the Philippines, are in a very tense relationship, and that social media has been sort of playing up this conflict, and many Filipinos now think that the Chinese as a group of people, as a race, are not our friends, And the unfortunately, many Chinese Filipinos are also seen as being pro-China instead of being Filipino or pro-Philippines. And so some of these factors present in the country such as the again the bad reputation of the pogos, with the recent also investigation of Alice Guo, and then the continuing poverty in the Philippines, where oftentimes the Chinese are scapegoated as the ones who are siphoning the wealth, uh, or just sort of like taking in all of the wealth from the Filipinos. And as China becomes more and more becomes a superpower, its position is a threat to the United States. So the U.S. is also, in a way, trying to push the Philippines, to stop China from spreading or extending its military force or might in the region. So the Philippines is also caught in between the sort of the power struggle between these two superpowers, U.S. and China, and all of these, don't do not actually help in decreasing or eliminating the ethnic antagonisms or tensions between what we call the Chinese or the Chinoys and the Filipinos in today's society. So I'll end there, and give some time for questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chu, for the very enlightening session. For guiding us to understand the terms and the history of Chinese becoming really Filipino. And then not also the history, but also trying us to understand the current situation. This is now, we are now open for this an open forum, so you can ask questions. But there are two comments that you might want to also answer or give your comment. So one is from Ban. The way I see it, sir, many Filipinos distinguish Chinoys from mainland Chinese, but their language is Mandarin or Hokkien. If they speak Mandarin, they must be from Pogo.
Well, I hope that's the case, because, for example, before they open their mouth or speak any Chinese language, many Filipinos, I guess, just from looking at them physically, would not distinguish them between the Chinese nationals and the Chinese Filipinos, and a number of, like, Solita Monsod, a few years ago, as well as national artist F. Sionil Jose, had written essays in the newspapers questioning the political loyalty of the Chinese Filipinos. We'll use the term Chinese Filipinos to refer to the Chinoys, no, as opposed to the Chinese or Chinese nationals. And so even these very well-educated, prominent Filipinos did not distinguish between the Chinese nationals and the Chinoys, stating in their articles that their political loyalty lies with China. So that's my take, and even if somebody recognizes that this is a Chinese Filipino, that they might still question their loyalty to the Philippines. And then the second one, I was wondering, though, if Chinese Filipinos would proudly identify themselves as Filipinos. In my own observation, many would distinguish themselves from ethnic Filipinos and look down upon them. Again, there is truth to that some Chinese Filipinos or Chinoys still look down on Filipinos. Like I said, the term "wana," the word that they use, is in itself already a reflection of that discrimination, because "wana" again literally means foreigner or barbarian, and then and so when somebody is called "wana," oftentimes that's associated with negative images. And even the term for domestic helper amongst the Chinoys, where we say "huanapo," means like a Filipina domestic helper. But having said that, this is just a smaller segment of the Chinese Filipino community, and this was because, like my own parents, their older generation, when they went to Chinese schools before 1975, these schools were under the supervision of the Republic of China Education Department. Because, as I said or pointed out, before 1975, many of the Chinese here could not attain Filipino citizenship. And so they had no choice but to be Chinese citizens. And so when they also went to these Chinese schools, they were taught that they were Chinese, no? That they were Chinese nationals, that they're loyal to China. But then after the nationalization of these Chinese schools in 1975, all these schools then stopped following the curriculum of China, but instead followed the Philippine curriculum. So like me, when I went to Xavier School um, in the 1970s and 80s, I was taught Philippine history. I was there's the flag ceremony and every Monday where we sang the Philippine national anthem, and then we also recited the Panatang Makabayan. So maybe younger generation of Chinese Filipinos who first of all were not born in China, secondly probably had never been to China until more recently, have no connections, really deep connections with China as a nation, but maybe still have connections with their culture, with their heritage. But that does not mean that they do not see themselves as Filipinos or look down on them.
Okay, thank you, sir. Um, there's one new message. Would you like to also, yes.
That aside from Hokkien, younger generation of Chinese can speak Mandarin because they were taught standard Mandarin Chinese. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly true, especially those who can speak Mandarin. But I must point out that in the younger generation of Chinese Filipinos, that there are few Mandarin speakers, no? And this is because in Philippine society, there outside the schools, there are also very few, if at all, people who speak Mandarin. So even while you learn Mandarin in school for, let's say, an hour or two every day, you don't get to practice it outside the classroom or outside your school. That's the case with me. I had 13 years of Mandarin language education, but after I graduated from high school, I could not really speak Mandarin fluently. But there are, of course, exceptions, and there are other schools that teach Mandarin better. But I agree with the point of Marinel Uy that if well, if one speaks Mandarin, then one should not immediately identify them as a pogo worker or employee or from mainland China, because there are some who can speak Mandarin well. I hope Filipinos can distinguish that. Man said, I'm sorry, I made that comment coming from law enforcement side, given the current situation in the country. Okay. Yes. Wait, let us see. Yeah, I agree with you. That probably, which is kind of sad because if we look at of our officials, our government officials or law enforcers, they need to be educated, because they're the ones leading the country, and so if they play on or persist having these stereotypes without really understanding the history and the context uh, of of uh, of the people living in our country, then they perpetuate these stereotypes that don't necessarily reflect the realities. And then, I in one of my slides I have this clip from Senator Dick Gordon, who I wish I had time to show that, but it clearly shows how even our own politicians uh, do not um, separate the Chinoys Chinoys uh, from the Chinese nationals. And in his an investigation of the Shabu shipment, he accused one Chinoy of being Chinese by insisting that he knew how to speak Mandarin. But that Chinoy said, "No, I don't know how to speak Mandarin." As if, again, that's the distinction being made, that Ban is referring to, that amongst the leaders, that's how they distinguish Chinoys from the Chinese nationals, that through the language, not proficiency in Mandarin. And then Marinel said, speaking from experience lang po, my dad is half Chinoy. Okay, thank you for that, Marinel. From Tim Gabuna, ano kaya ang tawag ng early Chinese traders sa Pilipinas before it was named by... You know what they call it? They call it Luzon, Luzon, because the island Luzon, so they call the place by its island names. So there's also a name called Mai. People don't know specifically whether Mai is Mindoro or some other island. So they call the Philippines based on the islands. There was no Philippines yet, no, like you pointed out, him. Then Richard, here in the US, I've noticed that many people from ethnic minority groups are very eager to identify with the white majority. But in the Philippines, it seems to me that many Chinese Filipinos who actually belong to an ethnic minority group are not as eager to identify with the ethnic Filipino majority. If my observation is true, what could be the reason for this? It could be true with I think, like I mentioned, the elder generation, because they were raised or educated in a way to think of themselves as Chinese, and that the Chinese race is better than the Filipino race, and so they didn't want to identify with the Filipinos because of that. There's this discrimination, uh, but. So it depends on which generation you're talking about, Richard. There are more and more people in my generation or younger generation who identify first and foremost as Filipinos, and eager to identify. with the ethnic Filipino majority. That being said, these things can change. As we can see, it depends on external factors or internal factors. If it's more matunog, if China is seen as really a superpower and a country that one would like to identify with, more and more Filipinos then begin to appreciate the Chinese side of their family, of their heritage, and so they start to become curious about their Chinese side, because then they could claim, oh, I'm also part Chinese, and so I also belong to a great race, or a great civilization, great country. So a lot of this depends on political factors, where if a country has a good reputation, then people would identify more with that, would like to identify more with that. During the height of Chinese communism in the 1950s and 60s, probably many Chinese in the Philippines didn't want to be identified as Chinese, because China was seen as this communist country, this evil country, but as China right now becomes a superpower, like in other countries, that more and more people would like to learn Mandarin, or would like to visit China. So it really all depends on also the geopolitical situation going on. Okay, someone from Saver 83. I'm Saver 82. So thank you for joining, Xiaomi.
Kasunod kayo. Okay, time check. It's now 9:56, and this is sleeping time of Dr. Chu. I forgot to mention in the introduction that Dr. Chu is currently a history professor at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. So actually right after Dr. Chu's graduation from PhD for universities in the US, hired him, and he chooses University of Massachusetts. So thank you so much, Rich, for your time and for sharing your expertise to us all. And also thank you for all the attendees. I'm sure you have learned a lot from this session. So again, thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Rich.